Hello and welcome back to my channel. I am Jess Connell and we are reading Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. This is part 6 and we're just going to get right into it. We are on chapter 26. William's desire of seeing Fanny dance made more than a momentary impression on his uncle. The hope of opportunity which Sir Thomas had then given was not given to be thought of no more. He remained steadily inclined to gratify so amiable a feeling, to gratify anybody else who might wish to see Fanny dance, and to give pleasure to the young people in general. And having thought the matter over and taken his resolution in quiet independence, the result of it appeared the next morning at breakfast, when, after recalling and commending what his nephew had said, he added, "I do not like, William, that you should leave Northamptonshire without this indulgence. It would give me pleasure to see you both dance. You spoke of the balls at Northampton. Your cousins have occasionally attended them, but they would not altogether suit us now. The fatigue would be too much for your aunt. I believe we must not think of a Northampton ball. A dance at home would be more eligible, and if—" "Ah, my dear Sir Thomas," interrupted Mrs. Norris, "I knew what was coming. I knew what you were going to say. If dear Julia were at home, or dearest Mrs. Rushworth at Sotherton, to afford a reason, an occasion for such a thing, you would be tempted to give the young people a dance at Mansfield. I know you would, if they were at home to grace a ball you would have this very Christmas. Thank your uncle, William, thank your uncle." "My daughters," replied Sir Thomas, gravely interposing, "have their pleasures at Brighton, and I hope they are very happy. But the dance which I think of giving at Mansfield will be for their cousins. Could we all be assembled, our satisfaction would undoubtedly be more complete, but the absence of some is not to debar the others of amusement." Mrs. Norris had not another word to say. She saw decision in his looks, and her surprise and vexation required some minutes' silence to be settled into composure. A ball at such a time, his daughters absent, and herself not consulted. There was comfort, however, soon at hand. She must be the doer of everything. Lady Bertram would of course be spared all thought and exertion, and it would all fall upon her. She should have to do the honors of the evening, and this reflection quickly restored so much of her good humor and as enabled her to join in with the others before their happiness and thanks were all expressed. Edmund, William, and Fanny did, in their different ways, look and speak as much grateful pleasure in the promised ball as Sir Thomas could desire. Edmund's feelings were for the other two. His father had never conferred a favor or shown a kindness more to his satisfaction. Lady Bertram was perfectly quiescent and contented, and had no objections to make. Sir Thomas engaged for its giving her very little trouble, and she assured him that she was not at all afraid of the trouble. Indeed, she could not imagine there would be any. Mrs. Norris was ready with her suggestions as to the rooms he would think the fittest to be used, but found it all prearranged. And when she would have conjectured and hinted about the day, it appeared that the day was settled too. Sir Thomas had been amusing himself with shaping a very complete outline of the business, and as soon as she would listen quietly, could read his list of the families to be invited, from whom he calculated, with all necessary allowance for the shortness of the notice, to collect young people enough to form 12 or 14 couples, and could detail the considerations which had induced him to fix on the 22nd as the most eligible day. William was required to be at Portsmouth on the 24th. The 22nd would therefore be the last day of his visit, but where the days were so few, it would be unwise to fix on any earlier. Mrs. Norris was obliged to be satisfied with thinking just the same, and with having been on the point of proposing the 22nd herself as by far the best day for the purpose. The ball was now a settled thing, and before the evening a proclaimed thing to all whom it concerned. Invitations were sent with dispatch, and many a young lady went to bed that night with her head full of happy cares, as well as Fanny. To her, the cares were sometimes almost beyond the happiness, for, young and inexperienced, with small means of choice and no confidence in her own taste, the "how should she be dressed" was a point of painful solicitude, and the almost solitary ornament in her possession, a very pretty amber cross, which William had brought her from Sicily, was the greatest distress of all, for she had nothing but a bit of ribbon to fasten it to, and though she had worn it in that manner once, would it be allowable at such a time, in the midst of all the rich ornaments which she supposed all the other young ladies would appear in? And yet not to wear it. William had wanted to buy her a gold chain too, but the purchase had been beyond his means, and therefore not to wear the cross might be mortifying to him. These were anxious considerations, enough to sober her spirits even under the prospect of a ball given principally for her gratification. The preparations meanwhile went on, and Lady Bertram continued to sit on her sofa without any inconvenience from them. She had some extra visits from the housekeeper, and her maid was rather hurried in making up a new dress for her. Sir Thomas gave the orders, and Mrs. Norris ran about, but all this gave her no trouble, and as she had foreseen, there was in fact no trouble in the business. Edmund was at this time particularly full of cares, his mind being deeply occupied in the consideration of two important events now at hand, which were to fix his fate in life: ordination and matrimony, events of such a serious character as to make the ball, which would very quickly be followed by one of them, appear of less moment in his eyes than in those of any other person in the house. On the 23rd, he was going to a friend near Peterborough, in the same situation as himself, and they were to receive ordination in the course of the Christmas week. Half his destiny would then be determined, but the other half might not be so very smoothly wooed. His duties would be established, but the wife who was to share and animate and reward those duties might yet be unattainable. He knew his own mind, but he was not always perfectly assured of knowing Miss Crawford's. There were points on which they did not quite agree. There were moments in which she did not seem propitious. And though trusting altogether to her affection, so far as to be resolved, almost resolved, on bringing it to a decision within a very short time, as soon as the variety of business before him were arranged, and he knew what he had to offer her, he had many anxious feelings, many doubting hours as to the result. His conviction of her regard for him was sometimes very strong. He could look back on a long course of encouragement, and she was as perfect in disinterested attachment as in everything else. But at other times doubt and alarm intermingled with hopes, and when he thought of her acknowledged disinclination for privacy and retirement, her decided preference of a London life, what could he expect but a determined rejection, unless it were an acceptance even more to be deprecated, demanding such sacrifices of situation and employment on his side as conscience must forbid? The issue of all depended on one question: did she love him well enough to forego what had used to be essential points? Did she love him well enough to make them no longer essential? And this question, which he was continually repeating to himself, though oftenest answered with a yes, had sometimes its no. Miss Crawford was soon to leave Mansfield, and on this circumstance the no and the yes had been very recently in alternation. He had seen her eyes sparkle as she spoke of the dear friend's letter, which claimed a long visit from her in London, and of the kindness of Henry in engaging to remain where he was till January, that he might convey her thither. He had heard her speak of the pleasure of such a journey with an animation which had no in every tone. But this had occurred on the first day of its being settled, within the first hour of the burst of such enjoyment, when nothing but the friends she was to visit was before her. He had since heard her express herself differently, with other feelings, more checkered feelings. He had heard her tell Mrs. Grant that she should leave her with regret, that she began to believe neither the friends nor the pleasures she were going to were worth those she left behind, and that those she felt she must go, and knew she should enjoy herself when once away, she was already looking forward to being at Mansfield again. Was there not a yes in all this? With such matters to ponder over and arrange and rearrange, Edmund could not on his own account think very much of the evening, which the rest of the family were very looking forward to, with a more equal degree of strong interest. Independent of his two cousins' enjoyment in it, the evening was to him of no higher value than any other appointed meeting of the two families might be. In every meeting there was a hope of receiving farther confirmation of Miss Crawford's attachment, but the whirl of a ballroom, perhaps, was not particularly favorable to the excitement or expression of serious feelings. To engage her early for the two first dances was all the command of individual happiness which he felt in his power, and the only preparation for the ball which he could enter into, in spite of all that was passing around him on the subject from morning till night. Thursday was the day of the ball, and on Wednesday morning Fanny, still unable to satisfy herself as to what she ought to wear, determined to seek the counsel of the more enlightened, and apply to Mrs. Grant and her sister, whose acknowledged taste would certainly bear her blameless. And as Edmund and William were gone to Northampton, and she had reason to think Mr. Crawford likewise out, she walked down to the parsonage without much fear of wanting an opportunity for private discussion. And the privacy of such a discussion was a most important part of it to Fanny, being more than half ashamed of her own solicitude. She met Miss Crawford within a few yards of the parsonage, just setting out to call on her, and as it seemed to her that her friend, though obliged to insist on turning back, was unwilling to lose her walk, she explained her business at once, and observed that if she would be so kind as to give her opinion, it might be all talked over as well without doors as within. Miss Crawford appeared gratified by the application, and after a moment's thought, urged Fanny's returning with her in a much more cordial manner than before, and proposed their going up to her room, where they might have a comfortable cause, without disturbing Dr. and Mrs. Grant, who were together in the drawing-room. It was just the plan to suit Fanny, and with a great deal of gratitude on her side for such ready and kind attention, they proceeded indoors and upstairs, and were soon deep in the interesting subject. Miss Crawford, pleased with the appeal, gave her all her best judgment and taste, made everything easy by her suggestions, and tried to make everything agreeable by her encouragement, the dress being settled in all its grander parts. "But what shall you have by way of a necklace?" said Miss Crawford. "Shall not you wear your brother's cross?" And as she spoke, she was undoing a small parcel, which Fanny had observed in her hand when they met. Fanny acknowledged her wishes and doubts on this point. She did not know how either to wear the cross or to refrain from wearing it. She was answered by having a small trinket box placed before her, and being requested to choose from among several gold chains and necklaces. Such had been the parcel with which Miss Crawford was provided, and such the object of her intended visit. And in the kindest manner she now urged Fanny's taking one for the cross, and to keep for her sake, saying everything she could think of to obviate the scruples which were making Fanny start back at first with a look of horror at the proposal. "You see what a collection I have," said she, "more by half than I ever use or think of. I do not offer them as new. I offer nothing but an old necklace. You must forgive the liberty and oblige me." Fanny still resisted, and from her heart. The gift was too valuable. But Miss Crawford persevered, and argued the case with so much affectionate earnestness through all the heads of William and the cross and the ball and herself, as to be finally successful. Fanny found herself obliged to yield, that she might not be accused of pride or indifference or some other littleness, and having with modest reluctance given her consent, proceeded to make the selection. She looked and looked, longing to know which might be least valuable, and was determined in her choice at last by fancying there was one necklace more frequently placed before her eyes than the rest. It was of gold, prettily worked, and though Fanny would have preferred a longer and a plainer chain as a more adapted for her purpose, She hoped, in fixing on this, to be choosing what Miss Crawford least wished to keep. Miss Crawford smiled her perfect approbation and hastened to complete the gift by putting the necklace round her and making her see how well it looked. Fanny had not a word to say against its becomingness, and, accepting what remained of her scruples, was exceedingly pleased with an acquisition so very apropos. She would rather, perhaps, have been obliged to some other person, but this was an unworthy feeling. Miss Crawford had anticipated her wants with a kindness which proved her a real friend. "When I wear this necklace, I shall always think of you," said she, "and feel how very kind you were." "You must think of somebody else, too, when you wear that necklace," replied Miss Crawford. "You must think of Henry, for it was his choice in the first place. He gave it to me. And with the necklace, I make over to you all the duty of remembering the original giver. It is to be a family remembrancer. The sister is not to be in your mind without bringing the brother, too." Fanny, in great astonishment and confusion, would have returned the present instantly. To take what had been the gift of another person, of a brother too, impossible! It must not be. And with an eagerness and embarrassment quite diverting to her companion, she laid down the necklace again on its cotton, and seemed resolved either to take another or none at all. Miss Crawford thought she had never seen a prettier consciousness. "My dear child," said she, laughing, "what are you afraid of? Do you think Henry will claim the necklace as mine, and fancy you did not come honestly by it? Or are you imagining he would be too much flattered by seeing round your lovely throat an ornament which his money purchased 3 years ago, before he knew there was such a throat in the world? Or perhaps," looking archly, "you suspect a confederacy between us, and that what I am doing now is with his knowledge and at his desire?" With the deepest blushes, Fanny protested against such a thought. "Well, then," replied Miss Crawford more seriously, but without at all believing her, "to convince me that you suspect no trick, and are as unsuspicious of compliment as I have always found you, take the necklace and say no more about it. Its being a gift of my brother's need not make the smallest difference in your accepting it, as I assure you it makes none in my willingness to part with it. He is always giving me something or other. I have such innumerable presents from him that it is quite impossible for me to value or for him to remember half. And as for this necklace, I do not suppose I have worn it 6 times. It is very pretty, but I never think of it, and though you would be most heartily welcome to any other in my trinket box, you happened to have fixed on the very one which, if I have a choice, I would rather part with and see in your possession than any other. Say no more against it. I entreat you, such a trifle is not worth half so many words." Fanny dared not make any farther opposition, and with renewed but less happy thanks, accepted the necklace again. For there was an expression in Miss Crawford's eyes which she could not be satisfied with. It was impossible for her to be insensible of Mr. Crawford's change of manners. She had long seen it. He evidently tried to please her. He was gallant. He was attentive. He was something like what he had been to her cousins. He wanted, she supposed, to cheat her of her tranquillity, as he had cheated them. And whether he might not have some concern in this necklace, she could not be convinced that he had not. For Miss Crawford, complacent as a sister, was careless as a woman and a friend. Reflecting and doubting, and feeling that the possession of what she had so much wished for did not bring much satisfaction, she now walked home again, with a change rather than a diminution of cares since her treading that path before. Chapter 27. On reaching home, Fanny went immediately upstairs to deposit this unexpected acquisition, this doubtful good of a necklace, in some favorite box in the east room, which held all her treasures. But on opening the door, what was her surprise to find her cousin Edmund there, writing at the table. Such a sight, having never occurred before, was almost as wonderful as it was welcome. "Fanny," said he directly, leaving his seat and his pen, and meeting her with something in his hand, "I beg your pardon for being here. I came to look for you, and after waiting a little while in hope of your coming in, was making use of your inkstand to explain my errand. You will find the beginning of a note to yourself, but I can now speak my business, which is merely to beg your acceptance of this little trifle, a chain for William's cross. You ought to have had it a week ago, but there has been a delay from my brother's not being in town by several days so soon as I expected, and I have only just now received it at Northampton. I hope you will like the chain itself, Fanny. I endeavored to consult the simplicity of your taste, but at any rate, I know you will be kind to my intentions, and consider it as it really is, a token of the love of one of your oldest friends. And so saying, he was hurrying away before Fanny, overpowered by 1,000 feelings of pain and pleasure, could attempt to speak. But quickened by one sovereign wish, she then called out, "Oh, cousin, stop a moment, pray stop." He turned back. "I cannot attempt to thank you," she continued in a very agitated manner. "Thanks are out of the question. I feel much more than I can possibly express. Your goodness in thinking of me in such a way is beyond—" "If that is all you have to say, Fanny," smiling and turning away again. No, it is not. I want to consult you." Almost unconsciously, she had now undone the parcel he had just put into her hand, and seeing before her, in all the niceness of jeweler's packing, a plain gold chain, perfectly simple and neat, she could not help bursting forth again. "Oh, this is beautiful indeed. This is the very thing, precisely what I wished for. This is the only ornament I have ever had a desire to possess. It will exactly suit my cross. They must and shall be worn together. It comes to in such an acceptable moment. Oh, cousin, you do not know how acceptable it is." "My dear Fanny, you feel these things a great deal too much. I am most happy that you like the chain, and that it should be here in time for tomorrow, but your thanks are far beyond the occasion. Believe me, I have no pleasure in the world superior to that of contributing to yours. No, I can safely say I have no pleasure so complete, so unalloyed. It is without a drawback." Upon such expressions of affection, Fanny could have lived an hour without saying another word, but Edmund, after waiting a moment, obliged her to bring down her mind from its heavenly flight by saying, "But what is it that you wanted to consult me about?" It was about the necklace, which she was now most earnestly longing to return, and hoped to obtain his approbation of her doing. She gave the history of her recent visit, and now her raptures might well be over, for Edmund was so struck with the circumstance, so delighted with what Miss Crawford had done, so gratified by such a coincidence of conduct between them, that Fanny could not but admit the superior power of one pleasure over his own mind, though it might have its drawback. It was some time before she could get his attention to her plan or any answer to her demand of his opinion. He was in a reverie of fond reflection, uttering only now and then a few half-sentences of praise. But when he did awake and understand, he was very decided in opposing what she wished. "Return the necklace? No, my dear Fanny, upon no account. It would be mortifying her severely. There can hardly be any more unpleasant sensation than the having anything returned on our hands, which we had given with a reasonable hope of its contributing to the comfort of a friend. Why should she lose a pleasure which she has shown herself so deserving of? If it had been given to me in the first instance," said Fanny, "I should not have thought of returning it, but being her brother's present, is not it fair to suppose that she would rather not part with it when it is not wanted?" "She must not suppose it not wanted, not acceptable at least. And its having been originally her brother's gift makes no difference, for as she was not prevented from offering, nor you from taking it on that account, it ought not to prevent you from keeping it. No doubt it is handsomer than mine, and fitter for a ballroom." "No, it is not handsomer, not at all handsomer in its way, and for my purpose, not half so fit. The chain will agree with William's cross beyond all comparison better than the necklace. For one night, Fanny, for only one night, if it be a sacrifice, I am sure you will, upon consideration, make that sacrifice rather than give pain to one who has been so studious of your comfort. Miss Crawford's attentions to you have been not more than you were justly entitled to. I am the last person to think that could be, but they have been invariable. and to be returning them with what must have something of the air of ingratitude, though I know it could never have that meaning. It is not in your nature, I am sure. Wear the necklace, as you are engaged to do tomorrow evening, and let the chain, which was not ordered with any reference to the ball, be kept for commoner occasions. This is my advice. I would not have the shadow of a coolness between the two whose intimacy I have been observing with the greatest pleasure, and in whose characters there is so much general resemblance in true generosity and natural delicacy, as to make the few slight differences, resulting principally from situation, no reasonable hindrance to a perfect friendship. I would not have the shadow of a coolness arise, he repeated, his voice sinking a little, between the two dearest objects I have on earth. He was gone as he spoke, and Fanny remained to tranquilize herself as she could. She was one of his two dearest. That must support her. But the other, the first. She had never heard him speak so openly before, and though it told her no more than what she had long perceived, it was a stab, for it told of his own convictions and views. They were decided. He would marry Miss Crawford. It was a stab in spite of every long-standing expectation, and she was obliged to repeat again and again that she was one of his two dearest, before the words gave her any sensation. Could she believe Miss Crawford to deserve him, it would be, oh, how different it would be, how far more tolerable. But he was deceived in her. He gave her merits which she had not. Her faults were what they had ever been, but he saw them no longer. Till she had shed many tears over this deception, Fanny could not subdue her agitation, and the dejection which followed could only be relieved by the influence of fervent prayers for his happiness. It was her intention, as she felt it to be her duty, to try to overcome all that was excessive, all that bordered on selfishness in her affection for Edmund. To call or to fancy it a loss, a disappointment, would be a presumption for which she had not words strong enough to satisfy her own humility. To think of him, as Miss Crawford might be justified in thinking, would in her be insanity. To her he could be nothing under any circumstances, nothing dearer than a friend. Why did such an idea occur to her, even enough to be reprobated and forbidden? It ought not to have touched on the confines of her imagination. She would endeavor to be rational, and to deserve the right of judging Miss Crawford's character and the privilege of true solicitude for him by a sound intellect and an honest heart. She had all the heroism of principle, and was determined to do her duty, but having also many of the feelings of youth and nature, let her not much be wondered at, if, after making all these good resolutions on the side of self-government, she seized the scrap of paper on which Edmund had begun writing to her as a treasure beyond all her hopes, and reading with the tenderest emotion these words, "My very dear Fanny, you must do me the favor to accept," locked it up with the chain as the dearest part of the gift. It was the only thing approaching to a letter which she had ever received from him. She might never receive another. It was impossible that she ever should receive another so perfectly gratifying in the occasion and the style. 2 lines more prized had never fallen from the pen of the most distinguished author, never more completely blessed the researches of the fondest biographer. The enthusiasm of a woman's love is even beyond the biographer's. To her, the handwriting itself, independent of anything it may convey, is a blessedness. Never were such characters cut by any other human being as Edmund's commonest handwriting gave. This specimen, written in haste as it was, had not a fault, and there was a felicity in the flow of the first 4 words, in the arrangement of "my very dear Fanny," which she could have looked at forever. Having regulated her thoughts and comforted her feelings by this happy mixture of reason and weakness, she was able in due time to go down and resume her usual employments near her Aunt Bertram, and pay her the usual observances without any apparent want of spirits. Thursday, predestined to hope and enjoyment, came, and opened with more kindness to Fanny than such self-willed, unimaginable days often volunteer. For soon after breakfast, a very friendly note was brought from Mr. Crawford to William, stating that as he found himself obliged to go to London on the morrow for a few days, he could not help trying to procure a companion, and therefore hoped that if William could make up his mind to leave Mansfield half a day earlier than had been proposed, he would accept a place in his carriage. Mr. Crawford meant to be in town by his uncle's customary late dinner hour, and William was invited to dine with him at the Admiral's. The proposal was a very pleasant one to William himself, who enjoyed the idea of traveling post with 4 horses, and such a good-humored, agreeable friend, and in likening it to going up with dispatches, was saying at once everything in its favor of happiness and dignity which his imagination could suggest. And Fanny, from a different motive, was exceedingly pleased. For the original plan was that William should go up by the mail from Northampton the following night, which would not have allowed him an hour's rest before he must have got into a Portsmouth coach. And though this offer of Mr. Crawford's would rob her of many hours of his company, she was too happy in having William spared from the fatigue of such a journey to think of anything else. Sir Thomas approved of it for another reason. His nephew's introduction to Admiral Crawford might be of service. The Admiral, he believed, had interest. Upon the whole, it was a very joyous note. Fanny's spirits lived on it half the morning, deriving some accession of pleasure from its writer being himself to go away. As for the ball, so near at hand, she had too many agitations and fears to have half the enjoyment in anticipation which she ought to have had, or must have been supposed to have, by the many young ladies looking forward to the same event in situations more at ease, but under circumstances of less novelty, less interest, less peculiar gratification than would be attributed to her. Miss Price, known only by name to half the people invited, was now to make her first appearance, and must be regarded as the queen of the evening. Who could be happier than Miss Price? But Miss Price had not been brought up to the trade of coming out, and had she known in what light this ball was in general considered respecting her, it would very much have lessened her comfort by increasing the fears she already had of doing wrong and being looked at. To dance, without much observation or any extraordinary fatigue, to have strength and partners for about half the evening, to dance a little with Edmund and not a great deal with Mr. Crawford, to see William enjoy himself and be able to keep away from her Aunt Norris, was the height of her ambition, and seems to comprehend her greatest possibility of happiness. As these were the best of her hopes, they could not always prevail, and in the course of a long morning spent principally with her 2 aunts, she was often under the influence of much less sanguine views. William, determined to make this last day a day of thorough enjoyment, was out snipe shooting. Edmund, she had too much reason to suppose, was at the parsonage, and left alone to bear the worrying of Mrs. Norris, who was cross because the housekeeper would have her own way with the supper, and whom she could not avoid though the housekeeper might. Fanny was worn down at last to think everything an evil belonging to the ball, and when sent off with a parting worry to dress, moved as languidly toward her own room, and felt as incapable of happiness as if she had been allowed no share in it. As she walked slowly upstairs, she thought of yesterday. It had been about the same hour that she had returned from the parsonage and found Edmund in the east room. "Suppose I were to find him again there today," said she to herself in a fond indulgence of fancy. "Fanny," said a voice at that moment near her. Starting and looking up, she saw, across the lobby she had just reached, Edmund himself, standing at the head of a different staircase. He came towards her. "You look tired and fagged, Fanny. You have been walking too far." "No, I have not been out at all." "Then you have had fatigues within doors, which are worse. You had better have gone out." Fanny, not liking to complain, found it easiest to make no answer, and though he looked at her with his usual kindness, she believed he had soon ceased to think of her countenance. He did not appear in spirits. Something unconnected with her was probably amiss. They proceeded upstairs together, their rooms being on the same floor above. "I come from Dr. Grant's," said Edmund presently. "You may guess my errand there, Fanny." And he looked so conscious that Fanny could think of but one errand which turned her too sick for speech. "I wished to engage Miss Crawford for the 2 first dances," was the explanation that followed, and brought Fanny to life again, enabling her, as she found she was expected to speak, to utter something like an inquiry as to the result. "Yes," he answered, "she is engaged to me, but," with a smile that did not sit easy, "she says it is to be the last time that she will ever dance with me. She is not serious, I think. I hope. I am sure she is not serious. But I would rather not hear it. She never has danced with a clergyman, she says, and she never will. For my own sake, I could wish there had been no ball, not this very week, this very day. Tomorrow I leave home." Fanny struggled for speech and said, "I am very sorry that anything has occurred to distress you. This ought to be a day of pleasure. My uncle meant it so." "Oh, yes, and it will be a day of pleasure. It will all end right. I am only vexed for a moment. In fact, it is not that I consider the ball as ill-timed. What does it signify? But, Fanny," stopping her by taking her hand and speaking low and seriously, "you know what all this means. You see how it is, and could tell me, perhaps better than I could tell you, how and why I am vexed. Let me talk to you a little. You are a kind listener. I have been pained by her manner this morning, and cannot get the better of it. I know her disposition to be as sweet and faultless as your own, but the influence of her former companions gives to her conversation, to her professed opinions, sometimes a tinge of wrong. She does not think evil, but she speaks it in playfulness. And though I know it to be playfulness, it grieves me to the soul." "The effect of education," said Fanny gently. Edmund could not but agree to it. "Yes, that uncle and aunt, they have injured the finest mind. For sometimes, Fanny, I own it to you, it does appear more than manner. It appears as if the mind itself was tainted." Fanny imagined this to be an appeal to her judgment, and therefore, after a moment's consideration, said, "If you only want me as a listener, cousin, I will be as useful as I can. But I am not qualified for an adviser. Do not ask advice of me. I am not competent." "You are right, Fanny, to protest against such an office, but you need not be afraid. It is a subject on which I should never ask advice. It is the sort of subject on which it had better never be asked, and few, I imagine, do ask it, but when they want to be influenced against their conscience. I only want to talk to you. One thing more. Excuse the liberty, but take care how you talk to me. Do not tell me anything now which hereafter you may be sorry for. The time may come." The color rushed into her cheeks as she spoke. "Dearest Fanny," cried Edmund, pressing her hand to his lips with almost as much warmth as if it had been Miss Crawford's, "you are all considerate thought. But it is unnecessary here. The time will never come. No such time as you allude to will ever come. I begin to think it most improbable. The chances grow less and less. And even if it should, there will be nothing to be remembered by either you or me that we need be afraid of. For I can never be ashamed of my own scruples. And if they are removed, it must be by changes that will only raise her character the more by the recollection of the faults she once had. You are the only being upon earth to whom I should say what I have said. But you have always known my opinion of her. You can bear me witness, Fanny, that I have never been blinded. How many a time have we talked over her little errors? You need not fear me. I have almost given up every serious idea of her, but I must be a blockhead indeed if, whatever befell me, I could think of your kindness and sympathy without the sincerest gratitude." He had said enough to shake the experience of 18. He had said enough to give Fanny some happier feelings than she had lately known, and with a brighter look she answered, "Yes, cousin, I am convinced that you would be incapable of anything else, though perhaps some might not. I cannot be afraid of hearing anything you wish to say. Do not check yourself. Tell me whatever you like." They were now on the second floor, and the appearance of a housemaid prevented any farther conversation. For Fanny's present comfort, it was concluded, perhaps at the happiest moment. Had he been able to talk another 5 minutes, there is no saying that he might not have talked away all Miss Crawford's faults and his own despondence. But as it was, they parted with looks on his side of grateful affection and with some very precious sensations on hers. She had felt nothing like it for hours. Since the first joy from Mr. Crawford's note to William had worn away, she had been in a state absolutely the reverse. There had been no comfort around, no hope within her. Now everything was smiling. William's good fortune returned again upon her mind, and seemed of greater value than at first. The ball, too, such an evening of pleasure before her. It was now a real animation, and she began to dress for it with much of the happy flutter which belongs to a ball. All went well. She did not dislike her own looks, and when she came to the necklaces again, her good fortune seemed complete, for upon trial the one given her by Miss Crawford would by no means go through the ring of the cross. She had, to oblige Edmund, resolved to wear it, but it was too large for the purpose. His, therefore, must be worn, and having with delightful feelings joined the chain and the cross, those memorials of the two most beloved of her heart, those dearest tokens so formed for each other by everything real and imaginary, and put them round her neck, and seen and felt how full of William and Edmund they were, she was able, without an effort, to resolve on wearing Miss Crawford's necklace, too. She acknowledged it to be right. Miss Crawford had a claim, and when it was no longer to encroach on, to interfere with the stronger claims, the truer kindness of another, she could do her justice even with pleasure to herself. The necklace really looked very well, and Fanny left her room at last, comfortably satisfied with herself and all about her. Her Aunt Bertram had recollected on this occasion with an unusual degree of wakefulness. It had really occurred to her unprompted that Fanny, preparing for a ball, might be glad of better help than the upper housemaids, and when dressed herself she actually sent her own maid to assist her, too late, of course, to be of any use. Mrs. Chapman had just reached the attic floor when Miss Price came out of her room completely dressed, and only civilities were necessary, but Fanny felt her aunt's attention almost as much as Lady Bertram or Mrs. Chapman could do themselves. Chapter 28. Her uncle and both her aunts were in the drawing room when Fanny went down. To the former she was an interesting object, and he saw her with pleasure, with the general elegance of her appearance and her being in remarkably good looks. The neatness and propriety of her dress was all that he would allow himself to commend in her presence. But upon her leaving the room soon afterwards, he spoke of her beauty with very decided praise. "Yes," said Lady Bertram, "she looks very well. I sent Chapman to her." "Look well? Oh, yes," cried Mrs. Norris. "She has reason to look well with all her advantages, brought up in this family as she has been, with all the benefit of her cousin's manners before her. Only think, my dear Sir Thomas, what extraordinary advantages you and I have been the means of giving her. The very gown you have been taking notice of is your very own generous present to her when dear Mrs. Rushworth married. What should she have been if we had not taken her by the hand?" Sir Thomas said no more, but when they sat down to table, the eyes of the two young men assured him that the subject might be gently touched again, when the ladies withdrew, with more success. Fanny saw that she was approved, and the consciousness of looking well made her look still better. From a variety of causes she was happy, and she was soon made still happier, for in following her aunts out of the room, Edmund, who was to hold open the door, said as she passed him, "You must dance with me, Fanny. You must keep 2 dances for me, any 2 that you like except the first." She had nothing more to wish for. She had hardly ever been in a state so nearly approaching high spirits in her life. Her cousin's former gaiety on the day of the ball was no longer surprising to her. She felt it to indeed be very charming, and was actually practicing her steps about the drawing-room as long as she could be safe from the notice of her Aunt Norris, who was entirely taken up at first in fresh arranging and injuring the noble fire which the butler had prepared. Half an hour followed that would have been at least languid under any other circumstances, but Fanny's happiness still prevailed. It was but to think of her conversation with Edmund, and what was the restlessness of Mrs. Norris, or the yawns of Lady Bertram. The gentlemen joined them, and soon after began the sweet expectation of a carriage, when a general spirit of ease and enjoyment seemed diffused, and they had all stood about and talked and laughed, and every moment had its pleasure and its hope. Fanny felt that there must be a struggle in Edmund's cheerfulness, but it was delightful to see the effort so successfully made. When the carriages were really heard, when the guests began really to assemble, her own gaiety of heart was much subdued. The sight of so many strangers threw her back into herself, and besides the gravity and formality of the first great circle, which the manners of neither Sir Thomas nor Lady Bertram were of a kind to do away, she found herself occasionally called on to endure something worse. She was introduced here and there by her uncle, and forced to be spoken to, and to curtsy and speak again. This was a hard duty, and she was never summoned to it without looking at William, as he walked about at his ease in the background of the scene, and longing to be with him. The entrance of the Grants and Crawfords was a favorable epoch. The stiffness of the meeting soon gave way before their popular manners, and more diffused intimacies. Little groups were formed, and everybody grew comfortable. Fanny felt the advantage, and drawing back from the toils of civility, would have been again most happy could she have kept her eyes from wandering between Edmund and Mary Crawford. She looked all loveliness, and what might not be the end of it? Her own musings were brought to an end on perceiving Mr. Crawford before her, and her thoughts were put into another channel by his engaging her almost instantly for the first 2 dances. Her happiness on this occasion was very much a la mortal, finely checkered. To be secure of a partner at first was a most essential good, for the moment of beginning was now growing seriously near, and she so little understood her own claims as to think that if Mr. Crawford had not asked her, she must have been the last to be sought after, and should be received only as a partner through a series of inquiry and bustle and interference which would have been terrible. But at the same time there was a pointedness in his manner of asking her which she did not like, and she saw his eye glancing for a moment at her necklace with a smile. She thought there was a smile, which made her blush and feel wretched. And though there was no second glance to disturb her, though his object seemed then to be only quietly agreeable, she could not get the better of her embarrassment, heightened as it was by the idea of his perceiving it, and had no composure till he turned away to someone else. Then she could gradually rise up to the genuine satisfaction of having a partner, a voluntary partner secured against the dancing, began. When the company were moving into the ballroom, she found herself for the first time near Miss Crawford, whose eyes and smiles were immediately and more unequivocally directed as her brother's had been, and who was beginning to speak on the subject, when Fanny, anxious to get the story over, hastened to give the explanation of the second chain, the real chain. Miss Crawford listened, and all her intended compliments and insinuations to Fanny were forgotten. She felt only one thing, and her eyes, bright as they had been before, showing they could yet be brighter, she exclaimed with eager pleasure, Did Edmund? That was like himself. No other man would have thought of it. I honor him beyond expression." And she looked around as if longing to tell him so. He was not near. He was attending a party of ladies out of the room, and Mrs. Grant, coming up to the 2 girls and taking an arm of each, they followed with the rest. Fanny's heart sunk, but there was no leisure for thinking long even of Miss Crawford's feelings. They were in the ballroom, the violins were playing, and her mind was in a flutter that forbade its fixing on anything serious. She must watch the general arrangements and see how everything was done. In a few minutes, Sir Thomas came to her and asked if she were engaged, and the "Yes, sir," to Mr. Crawford was exactly what he had intended to hear. Mr. Crawford was not far off. Sir Thomas brought him to her, saying something which discovered to Fanny that she was to lead the way and open the ball, an idea that had never occurred to her before. Whenever she had thought of the minutiae of the evening, it had been as a matter of course that Edmund would begin with Miss Crawford. And the impression was so strong that though her uncle spoke the contrary, she could not help an exclamation of surprise, a hint of her unfitness, an entreaty even to be excused. To be urging her opinion against Sir Thomas's was a proof of the extremity of the case, but such was her horror at the first suggestion that she could actually look him in the face and say she hoped it might be settled otherwise. In vain, however. Sir Thomas smiled, tried to encourage her, and then looked too serious and said too decidedly, "It must be so, my dear," for her to hazard another word. And she found herself the next moment conducted by Mr. Crawford to the top of the room, and standing there to be joined by the rest of the dancers, couple after couple, as they were formed. She could hardly believe it, to be placed above so many elegant young women. The distinction was too great. It was treating her like her cousins, and her thoughts flew to those absent cousins with most unfeigned and truly tender regret that they were not home to take their own place in the room and have their share of a pleasure which would have been so very delightful to them. So often as she had heard them wish for a ball at home as the greatest of all felicities, and to have them away when it was given, and for her to be opening the ball, and with Mr. Crawford too. She hoped they would not envy her that distinction now, but when she looked back to the state of things in the autumn, to what they had all been to each other when once dancing in that house before, the present arrangement was almost more than she could understand herself. The ball began. It was rather honor than happiness to Fanny, for the first dance at least. Her partner was in excellent spirits and tried to impart them to her, but she was a great deal too much frightened to have any enjoyment till she could suppose herself no longer looked at. Young, pretty, and gentle, however, she had no awkwardnesses that were not as good as graces, and there were few persons present that were not disposed to praise her. She was attractive, she was modest, she was Sir Thomas's niece, and she was soon said to be admired by Mr. Crawford. It was enough to give her general favor. Sir Thomas himself was watching her progress down the dance with much complacency. He was proud of his niece, and without attributing all her personal beauty, as Mrs. Norris seemed to do, to her transplantation to Mansfield, he was pleased with himself for having supplied everything else. Education and manners she owed to him. Miss Crawford saw much of Sir Thomas's thoughts as he stood, and having, in spite of all his wrongs toward her, a general prevailing desire of recommending herself to him, took an opportunity of stepping aside to say something agreeable of Fanny. Her praise was warm, and he received it as she could wish, joining in it as far as discretion and politeness and slowness of speech would allow, and certainly appearing to greater advantage on the subject than his lady did soon afterwards, when Mary, perceiving her on a sofa very near, turned round before she began to dance, to compliment her on Miss Price's looks. "Yes, she does look very well," was Lady Bertram's placid reply. "Chapman helped her to dress. I sent Chapman to her." Not but that she was really pleased to have Fanny admired, but she was so much more struck with her own kindness in sending Chapman to her that she could not get it out of her head. Miss Crawford knew Mrs. Norris too well to think of gratifying her by commendation of Fanny. To her, it was as the occasion offered. "Ah, ma'am, how much we want dear Mrs. Rushworth and Julia tonight." And Mrs. Norris paid her with as many smiles and courteous words as she had time for, amid so much occupation as she found for herself in making up card tables, giving hints to Sir Thomas, and trying to move all the chaperons to a better part of the room. Miss Crawford blundered most toward Fanny herself in her intentions to please. She meant to be giving her little heart a happy flutter, and filling her with sensations of delightful self-consequence, and misinterpreting Fanny's blushes. Still, she thought she must be doing so, when she went to her after the first two dances and said with a significant look, "Perhaps you can tell me why my brother goes to town tomorrow? He says he has business there, but will not tell me what. The first time he ever denied me his confidence, but this is what we all come to. All are supplanted sooner or later. Now I must apply to you for information. Pray, what is Henry going for?" Fanny protested her ignorance as steadily as her embarrassment allowed. "Well, then," replied Miss Crawford, laughing, "I must suppose it to be purely for the pleasure of conveying your brother, and of talking of you by the way." Fanny was confused, but it was the confusion of discontent. While Miss Crawford wondered she did not smile, and thought her over-anxious, or thought her odd, or thought her anything rather than insensible of pleasure in Henry's attentions. Fanny had a good deal of enjoyment in the course of the evening, but Henry's attentions had very little to do with it. She would much rather not have been asked by him again so very soon, and she wished she had not been obliged to suspect that his previous inquiries of Mrs. Norris about the supper hour were all for the sake of securing her at that part of the evening. But it was not to be avoided. He made her feel that she was the object of all. Though she could not say that it was most unpleasantly done, there was an indelicacy or ostentation in his manner, and sometimes when he talked of William, he was really not unagreeable, and showed even a warmth of heart which did him credit. But still his attentions made no part in her satisfaction. She was happy whenever she looked at William, and saw how perfectly he was enjoying himself in every 5 minutes that she could walk about with him and hear his account of his partners. She was happy in knowing herself admired, and she was happy in having the 2 dances with Edmund still to look forward to during the greater part of the evening, her hand being so eagerly sought after that her indefinite engagement with him was in continual perspective. She was happy even when they did take place, but not from any flow of spirits on his side, or any such expressions of tender gallantry as had blessed the morning. His mind was fagged, and her happiness sprung from being the friend with whom it could find repose. "I am worn out with civility," said he. "I have been talking incessantly all night, and with nothing to say. But with you, Fanny, there may be peace. You will not want to be talked to. Let us have the luxury of silence." Fanny would hardly even speak her agreement. A weariness, arising probably in great measure from the same feelings which he had acknowledged in the morning, was peculiarly to be respected, and they went down their 2 dances together with such sober tranquillity as might satisfy any looker-on that Sir Thomas had been bringing up no wife for his younger son. The evening had afforded Edmund little pleasure. Miss Crawford had been in gay spirits when they first danced together, but it was not her gaiety that could do him good. It rather sank than raised his comfort. And afterwards, for he found himself still impelled to seek her again, she had absolutely pained him by her manner of speaking of the profession to which he was now on the point of belonging. They had talked, and they had been silent. He had reasoned, she had ridiculed, and they had parted at last with mutual vexation. Fanny, not able to refrain entirely from observing them, had seen enough to be tolerably satisfied. Yet some happiness must and would arise from the very conviction that he did suffer. When her 2 dances with him were over, her inclination and strength for more were pretty well at an end, and Sir Thomas, having seen her walk rather than dance down the shortening set, breathless, and with her hand at her side, gave his orders for her sitting down entirely. From that time Mr. Crawford sat down likewise. "Poor Fanny!" cried William, coming for a moment to visit her and working away his partner's fan as if for life. "How soon she has knocked up! Why, the sport is but just begun. I hope we shall keep it up these 2 hours. How can you be tired so soon?" "So soon, my good friend," said Sir Thomas, producing his watch with all necessary caution. "It is 3 o'clock, and your sister is not used to these sort of hours. Well then, Fanny, you shall not get up tomorrow before I go. Sleep as long as you can, and never mind me." "Oh, William!" "What, did she think of being up before you set off?" "Oh, yes, sir," cried Fanny, rising eagerly from her seat to be nearer her uncle. "I must get up and breakfast with him. It will be the last time, you know, the last morning." "You had better not. He is to have breakfasted and be gone by 9:30. Mr. Crawford, I think you call for him at 9:30. Fanny was too urgent, however, and had too many tears in her eyes for denial, and it ended in a gracious well, which was permission. "Yes, 9:30, said Crawford to William as the latter was leaving them, "and I shall be punctual, for there will be no kind sister to get up for me." And in a lower tone to Fanny, "I shall have only a desolate house to hurry from. Your brother will find my ideas of time and his own very different tomorrow." After a short consideration, Sir Thomas asked Crawford to join the early breakfast party in that house instead of eating alone. He should himself be of it, and the readiness with which his invitation was accepted convinced him that the suspicions whence, he must confess to himself, this very ball had in great measure sprung, were well founded. Mr. Crawford was in love with Fanny. He had a pleasing anticipation of what would be. His niece, meanwhile, did not thank him for what he had just done. She had hoped to have William all to herself the last morning. It would have been an unspeakable indulgence. But though her wishes were overthrown, there was no spirit of murmuring within her. On the contrary, she was so thoroughly unused to have her pleasure consulted or to have anything take place at all in the way she could desire, that she was more disposed to wonder and rejoice in having carried her point so far than to repine at the counteraction which followed. Shortly afterward, Sir Thomas was again interfering a little with her inclination by advising her to go immediately to bed. Advise was his word, but it was the advice of absolute power, and she had only to rise, and with Mr. Crawford's very cordial adieus, pass quietly away, stopping at the entrance door like the lady of Branksome Hall, one moment and no more, to view the happy scene and take a last look at the 5 or 6 determined couples who were still hard at work. And then, creeping slowly up the principal staircase, pursued by the ceaseless country dance, feverish with hopes and fears, soup and negus, sore-footed and fatigued, restless and agitated, yet feeling, in spite of everything, that a ball was indeed delightful. In thus sending her away, Sir Thomas, perhaps, might not be thinking merely of her health. It might occur to him that Mr. Crawford had been sitting by her long enough, or he might mean to recommend her as a wife by showing her persuadableness. Chapter 29. The ball was over, and the breakfast was soon over too. The last kiss was given, and William was gone. Mr. Crawford had, as he foretold, been very punctual, and short and pleasant had been the meal. After seeing William to the last moment, Fanny walked back to the breakfast room with a very saddened heart to grieve over the melancholy change, and there her uncle kindly left her to cry in peace, conceiving perhaps that the deserted chair of each young man might exercise her tender enthusiasm, and that the remaining cold pork bones and mustard in William's plate might but divide her feelings with the broken eggshells in Mr. Crawford's. She sat and cried con amore, as her uncle intended, but it was con amore fraternal, and no other. William was gone, and she now felt as if she had wasted half his visit in idle cares and selfish solicitudes unconnected with him. Fanny's disposition was such that she could never even think of her Aunt Norris in the meagerness and cheerlessness of her own small house, without reproaching herself for some little want of attention to her when they had last been together. Much less could her feelings acquit her of having done and said and thought everything by William that was due to him for a whole fortnight. It was a heavy, melancholy day. Soon after the second breakfast, Edmund bade them good-bye for a week, and mounted his horse for Peterborough, and then all were gone. Nothing remained of last night but remembrances, which she had nobody to share in. She talked to her Aunt Bertram. She must talk to somebody of the ball, but her aunt had seen so little of what had passed, and had so little curiosity, that it was heavy work. Lady Bertram was not certain of anybody's dress or anybody's place at supper but her own. She could not recollect what it was that she had heard about one of the Miss Maddoxes, or what it was that Lady Prescott had noticed in Fanny. She was not sure whether Colonel Harrison had been talking of Mr. Crawford or of William when he said he was the finest young man in the room. Somebody had whispered something to her. She had forgot to ask Sir Thomas what it could be. And these were her longest speeches and clearest communications. The rest was only a languid, "Yes, yes, very well. Did you? Did he? I did not see that. I should not know one from the other." This was very bad. It was only better than Mrs. Norris's sharp answers would have been. But she, being gone home with all the supernumerary jellies to nurse a sick maid, there was peace and good humor in their little party, though it could not boast much beside. The evening was heavy, like the day. "I cannot think what is the matter with me," said Lady Bertram when the tea things were removed. I feel quite stupid. It must be sitting up so late last night. Fanny, you must do something to keep me awake. I cannot work. Fetch the cards. I feel so very stupid." The cards were brought, and Fanny played at cribbage with her aunt till bedtime, and as Sir Thomas was reading to himself, no sounds were heard in the room for the next 2 hours beyond the reckonings of the game. "And that makes 31, 4 in hand and 8 in crib. You are to deal, ma'am. Shall I deal for you?" Fanny thought and thought again of the difference which 24 hours had made in that room and all that part of the house. Last night it had been the hopes and smiles, bustles and motion, noise and brilliancy in the drawing room and out of the drawing room and everywhere. Now it was languor and all but solitude. A good night's rest improved her spirits. She could think of William the next day more cheerfully, and as the morning afforded her an opportunity of talking over Thursday night with Mrs. Grant and Miss Crawford in a very handsome style, with all the heightenings of imagination and all the laughs of playfulness which are so essential to the shade of a departed ball, she could afterwards bring her mind without much effort to its everyday state, and easily conform to the tranquillity of the present quiet week. They were indeed a smaller party than she had ever known there for a whole day together, and he was gone on whom the comfort and cheerfulness of every family meeting and every meal chiefly depended. But this must be learned to be endured. He would soon be always gone, and she was thankful that she could now sit in the same room with her uncle, hear his voice, receive his questions, and even answer them without such wretched feelings as she had formerly known. "We miss our 2 young men," was Sir Thomas's observation on both the first and second day, as they formed their very reduced circle after dinner, and in consideration of Fanny's swimming eyes, nothing more was said on the first day than to drink to their good health. But on the second it led to something farther. William was kindly commended, and his promotion hoped for. "And there is no reason to suppose," added Sir Thomas, "but that his visits to us may now be tolerably frequent. As to Edmund, we must learn to do without him. This will be the last winter of his belonging to us, as he has done." "Yes," said Lady Bertram, "but I wish he was not going away. They are all going away, I think. I wish they would stay at home." This wish was levelled principally at Julia, who had just applied for permission to go to town with Maria, and as Sir Thomas thought it best for each daughter that the permission should be granted, Lady Bertram, though in her own good nature she would not have prevented it, was lamenting the change it made in the prospect of Julia's return, which would otherwise have taken place about this time. A great deal of good sense followed on Sir Thomas's side, tending to reconcile his wife to the arrangement. Everything that a considerate parent ought to feel was advanced for her use, and everything that an affectionate mother must feel in promoting her children's enjoyment was attributed to her nature. Lady Bertram agreed to it all with a calm "yes," and at the end of a quarter hour of silent consideration spontaneously observed, "Sir Thomas, I have been thinking, and I am very glad we took Fanny as we did, for now the others are away, we feel the good of it." Sir Thomas immediately improved this compliment by adding, "Very true. We show Fanny what a good girl we think her, by praising her to her face. She is now a very valuable companion. If we have been kind to her, she is now quite as necessary to us." "Yes," said Lady Bertram presently, "and it is a comfort to think that we shall always have her." Sir Thomas paused, half smiled, glanced at his niece, and then gravely replied, "She will never leave us, I hope, till invited to some other home that may reasonably promise her greater happiness than she knows here." "And that is not very likely to be, Sir Thomas. Who should invite her? Maria might be very glad to see her at Sotherton now and then, but she would not think of asking her to live there. And I am sure she is better off here. And besides, I cannot do without her." The week which passed so quietly and peaceably at the great house in Mansfield had a very different character at the parsonage. To the young lady, at least, in each family, it brought very different feelings. What was tranquillity and comfort to Fanny was tediousness and vexation to Mary. Something arose from difference of disposition and habit, one so easily satisfied, the other so unused to endure. But still more might be imputed to difference of circumstances. In some points of interest, they were exactly opposed to each other. To Fanny's mind, Edmund's absence was really, in its cause and its tendency, a relief. To Mary, it was every way painful. She felt the want of his society every day, almost every hour, and was too much in want of it to derive anything but irritation from considering the object for which he went. He could not have devised anything more likely to raise his consequence than this week's absence, occurring as it did at the very time of her brother's going away, of William Price's going too, and completing the sort of general breakup of the party which had been so animated. She felt it keenly. They were now a miserable trio, confined within doors by a series of rain and snow, with nothing to do and no variety to hope for. Angry as she was with Edmund for adhering to his own notions and acting on them in defiance of her, and she had been so angry that they had hardly parted friends at the ball, she could not help thinking of him continually when absent, dwelling on his merit and affection, and longing again for the almost daily meetings they had lately had. His absence was unnecessarily long. He should not have planned such an absence. He should not have left home for a week when her own departure from Mansfield was so near. Then she began to blame herself. She wished she had not spoken so warmly in their last conversation. She was afraid she had used some strong, some contemptuous expressions in speaking of the clergy, and that should not have been. It was ill-bred. It was wrong. She wished such words unsaid with all her heart. Her vexation did not end with the week. All this was bad, but she had still more to feel when Friday came round again and brought no Edmund, when Saturday came and still no Edmund, and when, through the slight communication with the other family which Sunday produced, she learned that he had actually written home to defer his return, having promised to remain some days longer with his friend. If she had felt impatience and regret before, if she had been sorry for what she said and feared its too strong effect on him, she now felt and feared it all tenfold more. She had, moreover, to contend with one disagreeable emotion entirely new to her, jealousy. His friend, Mr. Owen, had sisters. He might find them attractive, but at any rate his staying away at a time when, according to all preceding plans, she was to remove to London, meant something that she could not bear. Had Henry returned, as he talked of doing at the end of 3 or 4 days, she should now have been leaving Mansfield. It became absolutely necessary for her to get to Fanny and try to learn something more. She could not live any longer in such solitary wretchedness, and she made her way to the park, through difficulties of walking, which she had deemed inconquerable a week before, for the chance of hearing a little in addition, for the sake of at least hearing his name. The first half hour was lost, for Fanny and Lady Bertram were together, and unless she had Fanny to herself, she could hope for nothing. But at last Lady Bertram left the room, and then almost immediately Miss Crawford thus began, with a voice as well regulated as she could. "And how do you like your cousin Edmund's staying away so long? Being the only young person at home, I consider you as the greatest sufferer. You must miss him. Does his staying longer surprise you?" "I do not know," said Fanny hesitatingly. "Yes, I had not particularly expected it. Perhaps he will always stay longer than he talks of. It is the general way all young men do. He did not the only time he went to see Mr. Owen before. He finds the house more agreeable now. He is a very pleasing young man himself, and I cannot help being rather concerned at not seeing him again before I go to London, as will now undoubtedly be the case. I am looking for Henry every day, and as soon as he comes, there will be nothing to detain me at Mansfield. I should like to have seen him once more, I confess. But you must give my compliments to him. Yes, I think it must be compliments. Is there not something wanted, Miss Price, in our language, a something between compliments and love, to suit the sort of friendly acquaintance we have had together? So many months' acquaintance, but compliments may be sufficient here. Was his letter a long one? Does he give you much account of what he is doing? Is it Christmas gaieties that he is staying for?" "I only heard a part of the letter. It was to my uncle, but I believe it was very short. Indeed, I am sure it was but a few lines. All that I heard was that his friend had pressed him to stay longer, and that he had agreed to do so. A few days longer, or some days longer. I am not quite sure which. Oh, if he wrote to his father! But I thought it might have been to Lady Bertram, or you. But if he wrote to his father, no wonder he was concise. Who could write chat to Sir Thomas? If he had written to you, there would have been more particulars. You would have heard of balls and parties. He would have sent you a description of everything and everybody. How many Miss Owens are there?" "3 grown up." "Are they musical?" "I do not at all know. I never heard." "That is the first question, you know," said Miss Crawford, trying to appear gay and unconcerned, "which every woman who plays herself is sure to ask about another. But it is very foolish to ask questions about any young ladies, about any 3 sisters just grown up, for one knows without being told exactly what they all are, very accomplished and pleasing, and one very pretty. There is a beauty in every family. It is a regular thing. 2 play on the pianoforte and 1 on the harp, and all sing, or would sing if they were taught, or sing all the better for not being taught, or something like it." "I know nothing of the Miss Owens," said Fanny calmly. "You know nothing, and you care less, as people say. Never did tone express indifference plainer. Indeed, how can one care for those one has never seen? Well, when your cousin comes back, he will find Mansfield very quiet, all the noisy ones gone. Your brother and mine and myself. I do not like the idea of leaving Mrs. Grant now the time draws near. She does not like my going." Fanny felt obliged to speak. "You cannot doubt your being missed by many," said she. "You will be very much missed." Miss Crawford turned her eye on her as if wanting to hear or see more, and then laughingly said, "Oh, yes, missed as every noisy evil is missed when it is taken away. That is, there is a great difference felt. But I am not fishing, don't compliment me. If I am missed, it will appear. I may be discovered by those who want to see me. I shall not be in any doubtful or distant or unapproachable region." Now Fanny could not bring herself to speak, and Miss Crawford was disappointed, for she had hoped to hear some pleasant assurance of her power from one who she thought must know, and her spirits were clouded again. "The Miss Owens," said she soon afterwards, "suppose you were to have one of the Miss Owens settled at Thornton Lacey. How should you like it? Stranger things have happened. I dare say they are trying for it. And they are quite in the light, for it would be a very pretty establishment for them. I do not at all wonder or blame them. It is everybody's duty to do as well for themselves as they can. Sir Thomas Bertram's son is somebody, and now he is in their own line. Their father is a clergyman, and their brother is a clergyman, and they are all clergymen together. He is their lawful property. He fairly belongs to them." "You don't speak, Fanny. Miss Price, you don't speak. But honestly now, do you not rather expect it than otherwise?" "No," said Fanny stoutly. "I do not expect it at all." "Not at all?" cried Miss Crawford with alacrity. "I wonder at that. But I dare say you know exactly. I always imagine you are. Perhaps you do not think him likely to marry at all, or not at present." "No, I do not," said Fanny softly, hoping she did not err either in the belief or the acknowledgment of it. Her companion looked at her keenly, and gathering greater spirit from the blush soon produced from such a look, only said, "He is best off as he is," and turned to the subject. And so I think we'll leave it there. That's the end of chapter 29, and the story is on the move. We are a good more than half, almost 2/3 of the way through the story. I hope you have a great day. I hope you're enjoying this read. And like I've said before, please share it with a friend if you know of someone who maybe is about to do a whole bunch of crocheting for Christmas or have a long drive ahead where they're going to do solo. A book like this might be precisely what they need. So share if you can think of someone who would enjoy it. Hope you have a great day. Bye.